Hi, welcome to the second episode, my quickies. Today I was going to talk to you about implementation, and more specifically I was going to talk to you about the principles of EPI, and so I'm going to give you some pointers as how you can come out with your own principle rooted in common sense, research, and sound theory, second language acquisition theory. Instead, I received quite a few questions on the back of my videos that I really would like to answer. And the question pertains to what I discussed yesterday. There are bound to be questions, by the way, if you're interested in what I'm talking about, because as I said, these are very informal talks from a sofa in a friend's house in the southeast of England. They're not meant to be thorough academic discussions of research and pedagogy. It's really off the cuff, as I said, stream of consciousness, thinking on my own 2 feet. So I have 4 questions that have been asked many more, but I'm going to focus on this 4. The first one is quite, it's a good question because I did only superficially touch on content. And the question is, is your content selection just a list of communicative functions, a list of grammar, or something combining the two? No, of course not. There's much more to that. First of all, let's consider a number of dimensions of content. Let's start with the quantity that some of you asked me about in the question. Well, you know my motto, right? My motto is less is more. And by less is more, we don't mean that you're dumbing down the content, but you are, again, with your students, remember the needs analysis in mind, and with the resources and context in which you work in mind, you will know what pace your kids can sustain in terms of learning. If your principle is, as it is with me, creating durable learning, aiming at fluency, because what is being automatized is never going to be forgotten, then the unrealistic pace of textbooks in the UK, whereby you're basically covering a unit every half term, which is about 6-7 weeks, you will understand that that is completely unrealistic. We know from research, and this is research that dates back to the 1885, 86, the famous Ebbinghaus curve. We know that after 7 days without consolidation, a human normally forgets about 75 to 80% of what they learned. And things get worse, of course. After a month, it can be even less than that is left in the kids' long-term memory. So with this in mind, the content, in my view, should be half the amount of that recommended by textbooks and their creators. So a meaty unit per term. Well, of course, it will depend also, even if you have kids who are not that academically gifted, you might actually even have to want to cover 2 units, one in the winter term, one in the spring term, and the other one will be revising, recycling the 2, maybe adding a few new bits, but mostly consolidating the other 2, because with less gifted, less academic kids, consolidation would be very important. The other dimension of vocabulary that I want to mention is, are you going to teach single words or chunks? Somebody asked me about that too. You know what I think about that. My belief is that, and it's rooted in scores of research, tons of studies, that teaching single words can happen when the students have learned a wide repertoire of patterns and chunks where they can slot those words in. But at the beginning stage, teaching single words is actually very counterproductive for reasons that I'm going to discuss in another CPD quickie, but refer to cognitive load. Processing is much harder in a foreign language that a lot of us may fathom. I do a lot of experiments in my workshops with my audience, and very often you have, out of 120, 150 participants, you have maybe 1 or 2 who can remember a sequence of words longer than 3. Most people can handle about 3 or 4 words at any one time. So chunks for me is the way to go. Again, you asked me, Gianfranco, is it better to have a community function based or a grammar based content? Well, my answer about chunks already gives you an idea of what I'm going to answer to that. And the answer is community functions and grammar together, but your outcomes will be stated in terms of communicative functions. What I did, I came up with, again, in my methodology EPI, I came up with 12 community functions, which are called the Majestic 12. And you can come up with 13 or 14 or less with 10, which, in my view, are the most important ones to enable a student to get by in the real world. And what is a community functions? Community functions were not invented by me, by the way. They were part and parcel of the communicative language teaching approach. And they're basically abilities, skills, which relate to real life. Like, for instance, I don't know, describing people, describing an object, indicating where a place is in relation to others, describing routines, behavior in the present or in the past. Comparing and contrasting, solving a problem, providing the pros and cons of an issue. You can phrase them the way you want, and but the most important thing is that they help you and your student to achieve the outcome that you will have come up with. In my case, and you can find them on the internet in my blog, that Majestic 12 we're also taking into consideration what my students between year 7 and 9 were going to do in year 10 and 11 once they would start the IGCSE course. So it was not just based on real life. I took into consideration also how they would pave the way for success at that stage. The other dimension of content that I want to discuss today is how then from those community functions you get to the selection of words and grammar. And the way in my approach we get to lexical phrases of words is by first breaking down a communicative functions, one of those 12 functions, I call them Majestic 12, into 4 or 5 micro functions, depending on how much time you have in your hands. So each function would be, imagine that you're talking about describing people or talking about oneself and people in your entourage. It could be describing their physical appearance, describing their personality, comparing and contrasting people. It could be describing their clothes. If you want to approach it from a more general kind of perspective, what food they eat. It all depends on the opportunities that your selection also gives you in terms of recycling of words and patterns later on, which is something we're going to tackle on in a future episode. So at one point, then you got to from the macro function describing people to the 4 micro functions. At that point, for each micro functions, you will select 1 or 2, depending on the time, again, you have available, 1 or 2 key patterns. Yeah, for instance, if it was reporting an event in the past, you could have something like subject, pronoun, so I, he, she, went, visited, whichever word fits in that slot to describe an event in the past, went to the plus place. So X went to Y with Z. And then in X, Y, and Z, you'll slot in all the possible lexical items that could go in there. So X could be me, my mother, my brother, my friend, my girlfriend. To the place where they could go could be the gym, the shopping center. You would choose high frequency words in each of those slots. And the third would be I went there with my brother, my father, and all the rest. So the whole idea is that you are focusing in your curriculum design on patterns that you can break down in further chunks, of course, with my father, to the place, my best friend. So it's basically sentence patterns made up of small chunks, but it could be also small words, which are high frequency. So these are high frequency chunks that you would use when you're describing people. And that would be basically your chunk, the chunks that I always talk about, that I'm obsessed with. From there, the third decision would be the lexis. So which words are going to go in those slots? And you'll frame all of that in a nice sentence builder, something that we'll read like, I don't know, yesterday I went to the shop with my mother. 2 days ago, I went to the shopping center with my sister. In other words, what Palmer used to call a substitution table. Highly structured, very accessible, with a bit of input enhancement where you will have highlighted a few keywords that you want them to notice, small function words or content words students find more difficult to learn, up to you. How about the grammar? The grammar is the final step of your content planning. It's where you basically decide, in order to make the chunk that I'm teaching these kids first purely through exposure and usage and rote memory, how am I going to make that chunk have strong generative power? What does it mean by generative power? I mean basically that this chunk can be manipulated at will in the future, so that the child has not just learned I went to the cinema with my mum, but she can use that pattern to say she went to the cinema, she went to the supermarket, they went to school, and instead of with my mother, with his mother, with their mother, and instead of mother, cousin and uncle. So in other words, what grammar is gonna enable that student to use that chunk creatively, autonomously, without any knowledge organizer or any revision sheet or any scaffold of any sort. And at that point, you will choose. For instance, in this case, in French, you may want to teach the perfect tense. But if you already taught the perfect tense, you might want to focus maybe on au à la au. You might want to focus on mon, ma, and all the other possessive, because you want them to teach them how to say, instead of with my mother, with his father, with their brother, and all the rest. So as you can see, the grammar happens at the end. Why? Because we said it's fluency that should drive curriculum design in my approach. Hence, grammar serves fluency, serves a communicative function, a real life purpose. As you can see, it's a complete change of mindset. And spoiler for you, what actually happens in my approach is the grammar is also taught afterwards, because my approach being a usage-based approach, whereby languages are first processed hundreds of times, language items are listened to and read many times before the child goes to speaking and writing. Grammar actually happens usually, always in fact, at the end of the process. The students have learned whatever is in the sentence builder, in the sentence frame, they process it many times over, that when they come to grammar, they know it already without much effort, because you took your own time there, at their pace, not your pace, not the one dictated by the textbook. And when they get to the grammar, it will be just a question of reverse engineering what they know already, as opposed to start with, a PowerPoint with an abstract grammar rule and a few words. And then, of course, a lot of kids will fail because their working memory cannot process all that information. The third question that I had, because I covered two without wanting to, I covered the content bit and the communicative functions question. By the way, on the topic of communicative functions, there's plenty of lists, not just mine. Communicative functions were invented, if you want, in the 80s by the advocates, proponents of the communicative language teaching approach. So there's plenty of lists, just Google them, communicative functions, you'll find loads. The third question I had was about the textbook. How does the textbook fit in all this? And my answer to this is that in my approach, it doesn't. I don't mind having 4 or 5 or 6, even if I'm teaching Spanish, textbooks available in the department, in my office, and having a look through them to find some text, some listening text, or reading text, or writing activities, or vocab activities which fit the bill, that really suit what I'm trying to do. But I don't teach top down. I don't let the textbook, in other words, dictate my teaching. Yeah? If bottom up, so based on what I want, I then find something in the textbook, so I could dip in listas or caminos or whatever, and I find that in there is something which now doesn't need too much adaptation, which is suitable for me, I will resort to the text. But it's always good to have a few copies here and there, 1 per teacher. But would I get my student to buy a textbook? No, I won't. I won't, for a reason. And the reason is that, a textbook, a course book, is basically a printed curriculum. Yeah, it's its equivalent of it. So it has to rest on solid acquisition, theory, and research foundations. And it needs to reflect the way we learn. Textbooks don't. I can give you 100 reasons why they don't. And one of the reasons is that the author of the textbook, who is a teacher like you and I, very often doesn't have carte blanche. You can't just write the textbook in the way he or she would like. There's so many constraints put by the publisher that in the end, a lot of it is a compromise between these two people. So even the author is an effective, talented, creative teacher, very often has got too many constraints to actually create what they would want to create. And I'm pretty sure that each and every author of those books would have their books be 2 or 3 times the size. Why? Because the textbooks that we currently find in the UK don't recycle enough. And without recycling, there can't be learning. They don't interleave. They don't make sure that the most important features of the language are constantly reappearing in every single chapter. Maybe verbs and tenses too, but not even really to a decent extent. I'll give another example, something that I should have mentioned before when I was talking about content. Not really the most important part of a sentence. The core bit is verbs. Yeah. Once you nail verb collocations, i.e., what comes after a verb, you have nailed sentence building. Because then, for instance, if you learned I went to the cinema, what we call a colligation, yeah, because a colligation means basically how chunks of words relate to each other in terms of pattern of grammar, syntax. Once you have I went to the cinema, then all you have to do is put yesterday I went to the cinema, and then with who you went there with. And in other words, the verb is the most important part of a sentence. Yet most textbooks that are reviewed are noun heavy. They don't, when you look at the texts, especially the easier ones, maybe they have 1 verb and tons of nouns. They may focus on conjugations, usually in their workbooks, not in the actual student book, but they don't really focus on verbs enough. And that is one of the reasons why kids usually end up using Google Translator. They're taught verbs, a few in isolation, loads of nouns, but they're not taught verb and what comes next, the collocations, the colligations, how words combine. When you teach chunks, on the other hand, and you make sure the chunks have a lot of verbs, a wide range of verbs, you won't have that problem, and your kids won't use Google Translator because you teach patterns and how to manipulate patterns. It becomes more like Lego building than gluing together loads of fragments of words. That was the textbook answer, I can give you many more other reasons why textbooks are not effective when it comes to long-term retention. One very important one is listening. Most of the listening and reading texts that you find in the textbooks are exploited only in the way of reading and listening comprehension questions. This is not, as you might know, if you read my blog and my book, this is completely antithetic to what I preach. The LAM approach, LAM, is about listening as modeling. You, as a child, you didn't have your mum coming to you with things and saying diapers, true, false, or not mentioned, or who was that, your daddy or the milkman? You know, you didn't learn like that. You learn through extensive modeling. Thousands of hours of modeling from your parents. That's the natural route of acquisition. Instead, in books, what you find, text, 5-6 questions. Kids don't read. They skim and scan, often because we ask them to do so, to answer questions. That's not listening as modeling, and that's not reading as modeling. So there's a thousands of reasons I could give you why the textbooks available at the moment in the market. I'm not saying that somebody's not going to come up in a few years or tomorrow with an excellent book, but the textbook for me and other published resources can be used just to dip into, to magpie here and there a few activities, but they require loads of adaptation, unfortunately. And we know full well that if kids are not happy with modern languages, there's got to be a reason. And because the textbooks are the dominant feature of curriculum design, I strongly suspect that textbooks are one of the causes why kids find languages difficult and don't learn. It's not the teacher's fault entirely, but books provide a safety net. You know, it's something when you haven't planned your lesson, or if you want to have an easier life, they're there. You just do activity 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Place your listening thing. You do your reading bit. At the end, you do a couple of writing activities, and you're sorted. The final question I had is about the fluency strand, and it's a very complex one. How do you get students to be fluent? I mentioned that you need to consider, and then this is where I'm going to stop today, and this is as deep as I'm going to go with this in the context of curriculum design. When I mentioned the 4 strands, and I mentioned fluency, and that is the most neglected one, is because very often when you deal with speaking, we go normally to the speaking activity a bit too soon. The kids are doing some information gap activity, some role play, very often heavily depending on a scaffold, on a list of words or expert help. They're never completely autonomous as much as I have seen them, or very rarely they are. And when they are autonomous, is only in a few things like describing pictures, but when it comes to spontaneous conversation, that doesn't happen. And my point here is that fluency should be a strand of its own, something, a specific type of training that you do once you're sure the student have gained the ability, reached the ability to recall, retrieve the material you've been teaching the unit autonomously. So you will have modeled extensively through listening and reading. Your kids will have plenty of opportunities to process receptively through listening and reading all the material that you put in the sentence builder, and hopefully material that you're recycling from previous lessons. After all this exposure, you will have made sure that the kids have plenty of opportunities through my translation games or through communicative tasks, small, cleverly, smartly graded. Yeah, there just should be task grading, which you don't find in my view in the textbooks at all. Plenty of opportunity to retrieve the material you've been teaching in highly structured tasks which pose very little risk. Once you have evidence through the stage that I call autonomy, which is basically a lot of retrieval practice, once you actually got evidence, your students own those chunks, those grammar structures, those words. At that point, that's where fluency should happen. That's where fluency training should happen, a final stage. So when you're planning for fluency, you make sure, in my approach, for instance, that you devote a subunit, a whole subunit, usually at the end of the macro unit, a whole subunit entirely to this work of fluency, where the students are given training at least in two ways, but there's more. One, production under time constraint, using activities like the famous 4-3-2 technique, marketplace, messengers, activities that force the students to produce language at a faster pace. And the other way you would train your students would be, of course, through loads of communicative tasks, where the students are not using any support. They will be given the chance to plan, of course, before, and to reflect on that task afterwards. But they're mainly real-life tasks carried out autonomously through negotiation of meaning of sort. But the build-up to that matters, because in most lessons I observed, in most contexts I worked in over the last 25 years, and after the thousands of conversations I've had with you online or face-to-face, this is not happening. And the biggest culprit is, alongside textbook, our rush. We are rushing through content, when actually to get an A star at GCSE, you only have 2,500 words. That's what you need, 2,500 words. Make them, if you divide 2,500 words by 5, it's 500 words. If you teach chunks and each chunk is about 3 or 4 words, you'll find that it becomes more and more feasible. And also, why are we rushing in year 10 and 11 very often? Because things have not been taught well between year 7 to 9. So what I'm advocating to you is very important year 7 to 9. Once you get kids who are spontaneous between year 7 and 9, the first 3 years in England, spontaneous in the understanding and production of what you will have taught in year 7 and 9, then you don't find yourself in the situation that every single teacher I know in England find themselves to in year 10 and 11, where they have to reteach everything that wasn't taught well in year 7 and 9. So less is more. If you can ditch the textbook, move from single words to chunk-based teaching and learning, and most importantly, ensure that you facilitate learning by lessening the load and the anxiety of these kids. Rushing through content doesn't just give you anxiety, but the students too. If I had a penny for every single student who came to me and said, "Sir, miss," or "Sir, rushes too much," we don't remember the things we learned. We have to cram all the revision right before the exam at the end of term in order to pass. So that's the end of a quickie. It doesn't feel like a quickie at all. I think it was just quite long. So I'm going to stop it there. Hope to see you again soon, and that you find this useful. Next time, I promise you, we'll focus on implementation. Stay safe and